Hi, it's Lili. Today I'm going to show you how I made this little pangolin by hand and from scratch. I'm going to start by explaining how I made the mock-up, then build up the skeleton out of round bar, and then use the TIG to build up the front with stainless steel rods. Then use copper to build up the main body and the scales. I hope you're going to enjoy this tutorial. The first stage of this project is to surround myself with gorgeous images of pangolin for reference. Then I build up a mock-up out of basic material, a leftover piece of plywood, some packaging material, some aluminium wire 3mm thick, duct tape and aluminium foil. I took my piece of polystyrene and started shaping it with the sanding knife first. Then I went over it with some sanding paper, tried to make some kind of an egg shape. Then I've laid some aluminium wire and tape it against my polystyrene shape. Use plenty of leftover aluminium foil to shape the heads and then the body. And I end up with this elongated type of burrito. Now I need to add some legs. I've wrapped up a long piece of aluminium wire around it, tape it against the body, roughly shaping the front paws. Wrap them with aluminium foil and repeat the same thing for the back leg. I made sure I had some wire that was longer than needed. I need the access to tape it onto the board and make the sculpture more stable. Now that the whole thing is covered up, I can start shaping the sculpture. The pose is really important with a sculpture. It's not just about making an animal. You need to create a movement or a position that is somehow interesting, and that's why looking at image reference or even video of that animal can help finding a pose that is dynamic and interesting to look at. I've taped the wire to the board and I was able to see which area needed to be built up a bit further with more aluminium foil. And I kept shaping it and adjusted until I was happy with it. Then I decided to cover with duct tape all the area that will be later on covered with copper, which is now duct tape, and the aluminium foil, which is going to be built up with the TIG and stainless steel rods. Now that I have my overall shape, I focus on the scale. It's always good to get back to reference image, especially close up. There's different type of pangolin, different type of scale, so there's some decision needs to be made regarding which types is going to be the main reference. I took some measurement of my tails and started to make a template on a piece of graphic paper. It's just easier to get the measurement clear on this kind of paper. I cut it out and tried on the pose and it feels like it was just a bit big. So I decided to make a whole series of templates, 12 of them in total, going from a size of 1 centimeter of width up to 5 centimeter of width. This gives me a great range to build it up and layer those scales on top of each other. Now to build up the real sculpture, I took another leftover piece of plywood, some round bar, 5mm for the core, that would give me strength. Then I moved to 4mm to build up most of the body and switched to 3mm for the smaller parts. I tried to get the measurement from one post to the heads and it was roughly 30 centimeters. So I took my round bar 5mm thick and cut 4 pieces of 30 centimeters, used the Dremel and the cutting disc to cut it out, marked up where my feet will be. I decided to put 2 round bar per feet for more stability. Get some measurement from the mock-up to make sure they keep the same kind of distance between them. Drill the board with the drill bit that is the same side as the round bar. If it's a tight fit, that's even better. So I press and push them into the holes and then I start shaping those bars. The 5mm are quite thick, but I need the thickness for strength. So I've got my 4 bars in. I decide to add one from the back, which is going to be better for weight distribution and overall shape. I'll mark it up, drill it, press it into it, and now my 5 bars are meeting in one central point at the front. I switch on my TIG. The one I use is Jastic 200p. Made sure I connected my earth to the main bar that I was about to weld because I was working on a piece of wood instead of directly onto the table. Then I TIG the 2 first bar, move the earth, repeat the same process on the 2 side bars of the other pose, and then connect my 3rd bar in the middle. That gives me a basic shape to work from it. From that point onward, I've used 4mm bar because it's just easier to shape by hand. And the great thing about having a mock-up next to it is I can easily shape it against the mock-up, get my measurement right, my bends correct. Once I'm happy with it, I can just move it to my main sculpture, keep adjusting and tweak it, and then I can TIG it. and I kept adding more bars, especially to create the tail. Having a wooden base isn't ideal for welding, but one thing I really like is I can easily remove it from the base, adjust the tail for example, and I don't have a base attached to it. Another way is to actually weld it to a piece of metal, but that means I don't have access underneath, the same way I can easily just take it out with a piece of wood as it is at the moment. I kept adding more pieces, weld them in place, and slowly build up the volume of my pangolin. It was a slow process to build it up, one bar at a time. To create the core of the back pose, I wrapped up a round bar around a tube to shape it, like a corkscrew type of shape, and then I can position onto my main round bar, and then I can twist it into position, take it in place, repeat the same thing for the other pose. I just kept adding more and more bars until I have a shape that starts to get more definition. Sometimes bars were not at the right spot, that's absolutely fine. I just cut it out with the Dremel, alter, change, tweak them, weld them back in a different position. So it's fine if they are not in the right spot straight away. It can always be altered and changed later on. So I can build it up and get more and more of a better shape as I go. At that point, I start to get happier about the overall shape and definition. You can see the skeleton of the pangolin coming out. One way to test out the volume is to get some aluminum foil and to wrap the whole sculpture. And it's like applying a first layer of skin if you want. That is a very good way of visualizing quickly what the overall volume is going to actually look like. Much easier than when you simply have the skeleton underneath. I can see straight away that my head is too big, is too straight. It needs to be at an angle and needs to be lower and smaller as well. So I can see much better now all the adjustment, and I think it's really important to get the position and the overall pose of the sculpture right, because it's going to be such an important factor in my sculpture. Whatever subject you decide of sculpting, whether it's a human or a creature, if the pose is boring, the sculpture is going to be boring. So you can really easily shift from something flat to changing the movement of the body, to tilt the head, to change the expression, and suddenly your sculpture comes to life. When I was doing my research and I was looking at pictures of pangolin, they were so damn cute. There was something about the attitude, their position. I can almost hear them say, "I'm so sorry, my lord." There was something about this which was absolutely adorable, and I wanted to try to translate in my sculpture. I think it's so important to think about the pose of whatever creatures you're creating, because you can really go from something flat and boring to something dynamic in few changes. Now, having covered my whole pieces with aluminum foil, I can see some issue as well that needs to be rectified, because at the moment my pangolin is definitely too fat. It needs to go on a diet, it's too wide there. I marked up the area that I need to remove or altered, use my Dremel to cut it out, and start to tweak and adjust bits of the tail, for example, re-weld them in the right position, and alter other spots in my sculpture to make them right. I reuse the part that I've cut out of the head and stick it on the side, because might as well reuse it, and from that point onward, I've used stainless steel rods that are 2.4 millimeter thick instead of the usual 1.6, because I'm about to build up volume and mass and might as well work with a rod that is thicker. Now, I'm fully aware that my welds are not the cleanest, and my weld will get better over time, I'm sure, but at the moment I'm just focusing on just building up some mass for the head. Okay, that gives me a starting point for the head. Now I need to continue the whole process in the neck, so I put it upside down and kept building up with the TIG. My welds really don't look that great, I'm fully aware of that, but I've got a special trick. By the time I've added all the mass that I wanted, I increased the amp of my TIG significantly, way above 90, and go over it with a torch so that it's gonna heat up and smooth the whole surface. And then I can clean up with a wire brush. And it looks a bit better already. That's my secret trick, don't tell anyone. Okay, so I've got a rough base for my head and neck. I need to continue the whole process around all the other area, on the tummy, on the pose, front and back. So I have a base and I can then build up a couple layers above it. So I kept building up some volume around the arms, flipping the piece over so that one side has a time to cool down while I build up the other side. Now that I have this first layer of skin, I can compare it to my mock-up, and I realized that I build up the curve of the upper chest too much inwards. It needs to come out much more, and I need to build it up. I always go back to image reference, which give me some important information regarding the movement and the mass of the body. I found some leftover piece that was actually a good reference in terms of the volume that I need to build, so I decided to actually just stick it on there, welding around it, so I can build up with this as a base. So now it was a bit better. I can see the volume on the chest and the tummy coming out a bit more. But my legs were actually coming out way too much. Even though the pangolin can stay on his back leg, the alignment is very different to what I'm building here. So going back to the image reference, I realized, okay, I need to adjust it significantly. I cut the legs around the hips, tack them in place, weld them back, and I kept building up around the legs, and I needed more mass around the feet as well. Now, even though it was better, it was still standing up upright way too much. My mock-up was actually a better reference of the direction of the body, so this needs to be significantly tilted. The day before, I've cut the legs around the hip and tilt the bottom part of the pose backwards. What I should have done is cut it just below the arms here and tilt the whole bottom way back. That would have been right. But by the time I realized it was Sunday morning. If I get the grinder and the disc cutter out, my neighbor would have killed me because of the noise, so I had to find an alternative. So I've decided to use my TIG torch, increase the amperage above 110, and start melting the round bars that was holding the front piece. I mean, if you get the TIG torch around the 3mm bar, they will melt within seconds. 4mm bar will take slightly more convincing. And I went all around the sculpture, cutting all the edges on the side, and actually decided might as well just remove the whole thing so I have complete flexibility and I can set up my front piece. I found a much better position, tack it in place, then I had to readjust and tweak quite a few bars to match the new position, weld them in place, and now that most of the round bars are reattached, it looks a bit better than before. I had to rebuild the back of my legs because I've tilted the position so much that they're not touching the table anymore, so I had to build that up, and I had to build up the part in between the legs as well. Now that doesn't look really good, I'm fully aware of that, but I'm just focused on getting the mass on, and then I increase the amp around 115 for example, and then I can literally melt with the torch all the metal, and I go above the whole surface, and then I give it a quick clean with a wire brush, and it looks so much better. Okay, so now I need to tackle the head, which was in the wrong position. So I'm sorry for the violent scene of decapitation that you're witnessing here. I had to cut it out, reposition it at a better angle, and take it in place, turn it upside down, and weld the neck back together. I kept building up the arm as well. I needed more mass there. Okay, so this is what I've got so far. I had to face the fact that my pangolin needed multiple surgery. It needed a nip tuck, a nose job, a neck job, a whatever tuck, everywhere. And I started working with my grinder with some aggressive sanding disc. Then I quickly shift to a cutting disc to remove more mass. And by the time I've cut all the mass that I wanted, I had some exposed area that needed to be built back up. So I used my TIG and went back and forth between the TIG and the Dremel to get a much better overall shape for my pangolin. Now to work on the clothes, I've used some round bar 5mm and 4mm thick that I slightly curve and cut into bits, and I TIG them at the end of the pose, and that was very tricky to hold it with one hand and TIG it and force it into place, so at least tack it, then I can get back to it with a wire. Now obviously this looked like a magnificent pedicure and manicure, I agree fully. The real work began with the Dremel. I used different aggressive burr and start shaping them, and after a lot of patience it started to look like something. Okay, now I've got a base that I can work with. I went back to my image reference and checked the nose. I still need to elongate it, so add more mass at the end of it. I also need to build more mass around the eye for the eye sockets and around the ear. Look at the shape of those ears, they're really cool. So I really need to build up some mass to work and create these ears. I mark it up with a permanent marker first, then use my TIG and some thick rods to build it up. And this is what I had by the end of it. It doesn't look beautiful, but it It doesn't matter to me. I have volume and that's my priority. Then I can carve it out with a Dremel until I have a basic shape. I know I'm gonna come back to it later on, but I have at least something that looks kind of realistic and I hope in the right position so that I can move forward. Okay, now let's work on building the rest of the body. I need to create some template, and for that I use cinefoil. It's a fantastic material that I use all the time. It's a thick black matte aluminium foil. If you don't have that and you have normal aluminium foil, the thicker the better. That can work. Personally, I prefer cinefoil because it's thicker, it will hold the shape better. So I took a piece of it and applied it onto my sculpture. With my finger, I can feel where the steel is finishing underneath, so I mark it up with a permanent marker, cut it out and adjust it until it fits. Use some copper sheet that is 1.2 mil thick. I copy my pattern onto the copper, cut it out with the jigsaw, deburr it with the flap disc. To soften it, I need to anneal it first, so I use my propane torch and I heat it up. You can see behind the flame the copper is getting this cherry red color, which is what I'm looking for. Then I quench it into water, dry it up, give it a quick clean with Scotch-Brite. Okay, so now I have my pattern copy onto copper. So I place my pattern back onto the sculpture and very roughly shape it. That gives me a sense of direction of which shape I'm gonna have to do and in which position I need to hit it. So I place it onto the sandbag, use some plastic mallets and start hitting and very roughly shaping it. It took lots of back and forth to get some initial rough shape. At the first stage, it's not exactly precise, but it gives a starting point. I can feel that the copper is getting stiffer, so I need to go back to the propane torch and anneal it again until I have the nice cherry red, quench it into water, and now it's back to being soft again. So I apply it directly onto the sculpture and hammer it onto it, so I have much better fit and it will follow the contour much better. I can see that it was getting too close to the eye for my liking, so I decided to mark it up and remove a bit of the copper on each side. I use the flap disc because copper is so soft. It will be removed very quickly. Place it back onto it. It was getting better, but by now the copper is getting stiff, so I need to go back to the flame, anneal it again. And the third pass, it was really about small little hit to really adjust the last detail. Now it's not a perfect fit, but I can work with that. I've switched on my TIG torch and use rods that are 100% copper. Now TIGging thin sheet of copper is not easy. I took some leftover piece of copper and some steel, and just to show you how tricky it is, because copper will work as a heat sink, so you need to fit it with lots of heat, but by the time you do that, the edges of the copper will melt. So I need to very quickly bring in the rods, almost too quickly, which is going to leave me with some very unpretty welds. Now I'm fully aware of that, but it holds, and that's my priority, because if I only bring the TIG, even on a low amp, look at this, poof, gone. It will melt so quickly. So you have to fight against the melting by feeding more rods. So it isn't about making beautiful welds, it's just about trying to make it work with a very tricky process of welding copper. Now it's not pretty, I'm fully aware of it, but it holds and I can grind it down with a flap disc. Okay, that gave me a good starting point. I repeat the process with the next piece, create a template out of cinefoil first, cut it out, copy onto copper, anneal it, shaping it onto the sandbag until I have a nice fit, weld it, grind it, and then move to the next part. When it comes to small area like this one with a significant curve, I find it easier to work on small part instead of using a big piece of copper that's going to be harder to control. So I made a really small template, copied onto copper, anneal it, and that was easier to manage to get the right shape. I TIG it and grind it and move to the next part. Now, because it's a more gentle curve, I can work on a bigger piece of copper. This one is going to be much easier and quicker to shape to follow the body. I kept adding more pieces and I was very soon getting at the end of the 1.2 mil thick copper, even using every last bit of the copper I could to just fill the gaps. And then I had to move to the 0.9 mil thick. Both works, but I have slightly less meat to work with the TIG, and so it's going to make it even more tricky. As you can see, the whole body start to come together. It look a bit bit patchy. You can see the transition between the parts, it's a bit bumpy, but that's absolutely fine. For me, my focus is just to get one big shape that I can work with as the base, because everything is going to be covered with scale, so you're not going to see the bump and the transition anyway, so it doesn't really matter. From now on, I work with copper that was 0.9 mil thick, and I have some bigger sheets, so I decided to work underneath and try to do it as one piece. That was initially my goal. So I create my pattern with the cinefoil, cut it out and adjust it, copy onto a piece of copper, anneal it and shape it, and I could quickly see that it was better to actually separate the end tail so I can readjust and weld it in the right position. Then I weld the whole thing, grind it down. Okay, so now it looks good. I have the base. I just need to cut a few more pieces to fill all the gaps until the whole body is covered. So now, as you can see, I have plenty of bumps. It doesn't look that smooth. That's absolutely fine. I just need a base. This is the first layer of skin. I'm going to build it up with skills. Now, talking about skills, you might remember at the beginning of this tutorial, I mentioned how I made the template, the 12 templates for the scale. That's what I've used moving forward. The copper I've decided to work with was 0.9 mm thick. I've copied my template onto copper with a permanent marker, cut it out with my jigsaw, and used image reference, very important, to follow the edges. They were nicely rounded, but they had like a peak, so I used some abrasive stone at the end of my Dremel and slowly start to shape the edges, but the tip especially with that. And going back to the reference image, you can see the edges are not regular. They are almost damaged and there's little detail here and there which give it much more realism, and that's what I'm going to try to replicate. So I use a bird that is much more aggressive, and in a way I start to damage the edges and mark it up here and there to have something actually more dynamic. I deburr it using a blender from Norton Vortex that I like because it does the job in like half a second. It's brilliant. Now I've cut it out with the jigsaw, deburr it on the edge that I've just cut, and that gave me my first line. Obviously I had to replicate this like 500,000 times. I've tried to create roughly 3 lengths of each template to give me a base. I knew I will need to come back to it and do more, but it gave me a starting point. Now to texture it, I need to anneal it first. So I used the propane torch and heat it up until I had a nice cherry red. Once I reached this color, I quench it into water, dry it up, and give it a quick clean with the Scotch-Brite. Then I use the wire brush at the end of my drill to clean up all the scratches and give me a much better base. Now to really texture it, I need to set it into pitch. This is natural pine resin pitch that you can find at most jewelry stores online. What I'm holding in my hand right now is roughly 2 kilos of pitch. I decide to steal a baking tray of my oven and use roughly 5 kilos of resin to get that mass. Now my apologies for the image being blurry. I fold the edges downwards just so that it will give me more anchor into the pitch. Warm it up with a heat gun. It's all about heating it up enough so that it's softer but not too liquid so that it will sink deeply. I press it into it, hold on for a few seconds, and then work on the next one. Now you can see much better. I leave it sit for at least 5 minutes because it needs to cool down before I can start working on the texture. Going back to the image reference, I can see that the lines work almost like a fan. You have the straight line in the middle and then it goes outwards on either side, and that's what I'm going to try to reproduce. I use some old chisel. I need to round up the edges slightly because I wanted to mark, I didn't want it to cut the metal. So I apply the chisel in the middle first and then start to go outwards on either side. The first few pieces of copper that I did were a bit tricky, and then just like everything, it's get easier and quicker once you have a system going. By the time I finish all my pieces, the pitch is well cold, so some of those copper pieces come out very quickly. Some other are probably buried a bit deeper, so it's easier to just grab the heat gun, warm it up, use some kind of screwdriver or something to lift it up. To remove the pitch that is stuck onto the copper, for the bigger part I use a Stanley knife, and then I position my piece onto paper towel, heat it up with a heat gun until the metal is well hot, and then it will come off very quickly and easily. The last thing I need to do is reverse the curve. At the moment, because of the chiseling, the fold come a bit inwards. I need to reverse that in the other direction. So I use the sandbag and the plastic mallets and slowly beat it up until I had the nice shape. And you can see once you add them on top of each other, now it starts start to look really nice. Obviously I had to repeat this system many times. I had also to adapt a smaller chisel as I was moving towards smaller pieces to be able to get in there basically and shape all of those lovely scales. So I've done 3 or 4 lengths of each size, and I know it's not going to be enough. I'm going to need much more than that, but it gave me a starting point. I've used a small scale first to go around the back paws, front paws and the tail. And this is so damn small that if you approach it with the TIG, it's going to melt right away. So just to give you an example, you see the small sample here? I'm going to switch on my TIG, and if I get on the usual, let's say 80 or 90 amp, it would just melt away. All the texture, everything is just gone within literally seconds. The problem is temperature. The TIG is too high. So I went back to a book that I read probably 9 to 10 months ago when I started to get interested into copper. The book is called Sculpting in Copper by Sue White-Oaks. It is gorgeous. Lots of beautiful work. I really recommend it. It's really well explained. And I remember in it, she was explaining that she doesn't do welding. She's doing soldering with some brazing rods. And the one she used is silver alloy. So I did a bit of research on the internet and I found a company who still sell those. Is Build Shorthouse Metals, and I'm not sponsored by them or any company. I'm buying all my products and I pay full price for them. But I found those silver alloy, also called metal brace. They're available in 3mm or 1.5mm. I use 1.5mm for most of the project. It doesn't require flux, which is great, and I've used my little propane torch for it. I place a little bit of steel under the first solo scale, use one of the brazing rod, silver alloy, and I start heating it up with the torch, and the problem is not heating up the tiny scale, which is so small it's going to take half a second to get to the annealing point of cherry red. The problem is that you have to heat the whole tail, which is connected to the whole body, and because copper works as a whole mass and heat sink, going to fit it took forever. From the start I realized it's going to be a very slow process of heating the whole thing, then I can bring the brazing rod. It wasn't as quick as I was expecting, so I thought, okay, what's the next stage up? And that is combining propane with oxygen, which will act like a booster and it will bring up the heat much higher than just the propane alone. I had my very small home kits. Look at the size of this bottle, it's so cute. And one thing I like about this very small home kit is the size of the torch is very small and precise if you compare it to the usual propane torch. So I tried it on and straight away I can see that it was working much better. I can reach the annealing point much quicker, but that also meant I had to be very careful because between the annealing point and melting point there's not a big of gap. So I have to go really quickly, otherwise I will go beyond it and the little scale will start to melt. So it was a much quicker job, but it was going much more efficiently. I used some small jewelry pliers to be able to shape each round of scale and also a shear to cut it to size. Those are the main tools I've used all along the tail. I was really happy with it. Honestly, the propane and oxy combined was working great and I was doing a good job efficiently and quickly. So I kept going, adding one scale at a time, brazing it, keep going, another scale, another row. I was happy with it, it was going well, but one thing I didn't anticipate is the amount of oxygen this will require. But you see this length, for example, it used the whole bottle of oxygen. I know it's a small bottle, but I didn't expect it to use that much of it. And considering the surface that I will still have to cover with scale, I will need probably 3 to 4 bottles of oxygen or a much bigger one, and I need to go far away to pick that one up. So what can I do to continue with those scales without requiring that much oxygen? So the idea was to go back to the TIG, but work on the amperage much differently. When the copper was completely cold, I started at 60 or even 50 amp. As soon as the copper started heating up, then I went down to 40 and then below it. If I was working on the smallest, tiniest scale, I was working even on 20 amp or even below, I remember. I mean, it did work. It took a bit of practice and the soldering point wasn't as smooth as they were before, but it was feasible and that's what mattered to me at that point. So I kept going and using those brazing rod with the TIG moving forward. My next challenge was gravity, because you see, when you work with copper, it's not when you work with steel. Usually I use those big heavy blocks to hold my pieces in place while I reach the TIG. I cannot use magnets because it doesn't work on copper the way it works on steel, so those are a bit useless in this case. I went back to the book that I mentioned earlier with the work of Sue White Oaks, and I remembered she had a little trick which was using those kind of clips with steel. I had some leftover of steel, roughly 1 millimeter thick I will say. I cut some length, then cut it to size and shaped the edges until they were pointy. I realized later on they need to be much more pointier than that to do the job really nicely. But I tried it out. It took a bit of practice, but it works. And moving forward, I've used them to hold those pieces and those scales in place while I was reaching the TIG. Okay, so that was going well. My soldering joints weren't as smooth as they were before when I was using the torch with the oxy, but those are going to be hidden, and that's what mattered to me. Moving on to the back pose. I used the smallest scale available, create a little ring, then I press and hold against the pose, and I was doing the soldering at the back. I used 2 rows of the small scale, then went up and had 2 more rows of the next scale up, and I kept going until I built like a little pence going upwards at a diagonal, I will say. So I need those scales to blend into the much bigger scale of the rest of the body. So I went upward on the side, and then I also build up all the back. They will meet at the same height where the pent is finishing. Then I moved to the much smaller front pose, and that was the harder and trickier part because it was so damn small. And obviously I went down to the scale, have to really work with such a tiny proportion. And welding it was really hard because I used the TIG even below the 20 amp. I was at 18 at some point and I had a really short window. If I stayed too long, poof, it would still melt the copper. It was really hard. So I kept adding more and more scale. It seems like it was an endless need for more scale to be cut, shaped, and welded into place. It feels like I've done like 1,000,000 scale for this sculpture. I've added a muzzle with my TIG and pure copper rods. And I kept adding more and more scale, getting smaller each time, and it was getting trickier and more challenging to weld without melting it. I got closer and closer towards the head, and the scale were getting thinner, up to the point that I barely have 1 or 2 scale per line, which took a lot of patience and adjustment before I was able to weld it. And this is what it looked like when it's all welded, and it looks a bit better after some wire brushing, but at that point it still needed a lot of touch-up. So I spent some time with my Dremel and different bits to smooth things up, to touch up, to add some detail until I was satisfied with the overall sculpture. Then I cleaned up with acetone and added some eye. I used those tiny pins that have like a ball at the top of it and tried to cut out just the end of it. It was so small, it was very tricky. Super glue in place and then use black gesso to prime it and then paint it. And finally I've added 2 coats of clear matte sealer. Now the sculpture is finished, and as every other sculpture with steel and copper mixed, I keep the sculpture indoor and away from moisture to reduce the potential of corrosion. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and that the technique that I've demonstrated are somehow useful for your own project. I haven't decided yet what's going to be my next tutorial, but I know one thing for sure. I'm not going to do scale anymore. I'm good with scale now. Enough. Okay, so until next tutorial, I hope you look after yourself with care. See you very soon. Bye bye.